Well, BookTV is on location at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. for our college series. This is a chance to talk with some professors who have also written books and to introduce you to those books. Next up, we're going to be talking with Matthew Hindman, who is the author of this book, The Myth of Digital Democracy. Professor Hindman, first of all, what is digital democracy?
Well, the book is really about the claims that a lot of people have had about how the internet is changing politics. Everything from how campaigns are run, to how we get our news, to how we process and interact with politicians.
And what is the myth of digital democracy?
When we talk about the internet from very early on, even from the early 90s, a lot of the claims were not so much about how the internet would change business or change our world. It was also about how the internet would change politics. And particularly there are very robust, very durable claims that we have about how the internet is supposed to empower ordinary citizens. So the real hope was that the internet would allow campaigns to be run differently, to be less elite-focused, elite-driven. It would allow citizens to, in some cases, even create their own news. And the real hope was that ordinary people would have a greater voice in the political system. Some parts of that dream have come true, but many others have not.
Well, what are some of the success stories?
Well, I argue in the book that certainly in the 2004 and the 2008 campaign cycle, we really did see a campaign where big money was comparatively less important than it had been in previous cycles. That we saw more of the money that ran presidential campaigns coming from people of middle incomes. So that's certainly...
Who could donate online or access
Absolutely.
online information.
And so we certainly saw first with Dean, then with Kerry, and of course in 2008 with Obama, we saw a much larger portion of the money that makes politics work coming from more or less ordinary citizens, not from the top 1/10% of the income distribution.
Well, in your book, The Myth of Digital Democracy, you have a chapter, The Lessons of Howard Dean.
Right. So the argument in that chapter is that it's pretty easy to understand why Howard Dean failed. It's not that so much of the literature on presidential primaries focuses on momentum, and once you stumble, once you have something bad happen to your campaign, it's very difficult to recover. But the real puzzle for Dean is how he ever got to be the frontrunner, the Democratic frontrunner in the first place. And there, I would argue that the answer has to be the internet. That in practice, in 2004, the internet was essentially a primary, a digital primary for the Democrats, and was a primary among a very liberal constituency. And Dean more or less won that primary. He walked away with it. At the same time, simply winning an early digital primary doesn't necessarily help you when you have to go up against the voters in Iowa.
Matthew Hindman, you have a chart in your book, Total Web Traffic.
That's
Explain
right.
this.
Yeah. One of the things that the book talks about is that if we're thinking about how the internet is going to change politics, we have to start with the facts. And the facts are that politically relevant traffic is a tiny, tiny portion of what people actually do online. So if you look at the categories of where people go, about 10%, more than 10% of what people do online is visit adult or pornographic content. Webmail is slightly less. Search engines are about 7% of what people do. News and media sites, which includes everything from entertainment news to sports to hard news, is only about 3 to 4%. The types of political sites that have been so heavily hyped, sites like political blogs or sites of interest groups, campaign sites, the new types of political information that were supposed to change everything, only are about 1/10 of 1% of all web traffic.
How many people or how many hits does that represent?
Larger than you would think. The part of the issue with web traffic is that people visit lots and lots of sites. So according to some numbers, places like ComScore, an average visitor an average web user may hit 80 or 90 pages in a day, which is a lot. At the same time, the portion of traffic that's actually going to political sites is quite small.
Barack Obama, 2008, and the internet.
I think that it's pretty clear that Barack Obama would not have been the Democratic nominee in 2008 without the internet. It was a very close race, and the internet was very important in Obama's success. Some of this is pretty well known, the notion that he raised an awful lot of money online. Some parts of this story are less well known. For example, it's very difficult to imagine Obama winning the Democratic race without winning Iowa. And in some place like Iowa, tools like Facebook proved very important. The ability for an organizer to roll into a small town in Iowa and already have half a dozen volunteers makes a huge difference to the on-the-ground organization. Many operatives will tell you that it's much harder to get the first dozen volunteers than it is to get the next 100. So in that sense, we really do see pretty big evidence that the internet matters. And I would even go further. I would say that, and this is not quite so well known, but I would argue that John McCain would most likely not have been the Republican nominee but for the internet. In the summer of 2007, when things were looking pretty bleak for the McCain candidacy, and everyone was expecting Rudy Giuliani to square off against Hillary Clinton, McCain went to ground, cut almost all of his campaign staff, except for a few senior folks and the web team. And that is what sustained McCain all the way up to Iowa and New Hampshire, and made him and kept him alive as a viable candidate, or at least as a possibility, through the early part of the campaign cycle.
What about conservative and liberal viewpoint websites?
So there is a big gap between conservatives and liberals online. And in fact, the traffic numbers hugely favor liberals by about 2 to 1. In terms of, you're holding up a chart there, which is a graph of web traffic. On the black sites in this rendering are liberal sites, left-leaning sites, and the white sites are conservative-leaning sites. You see a couple of things. First of all, there's much, in terms of total traffic, there's much more traffic to the left. Second of all, traffic is more concentrated, actually, on the right. So you see what traffic there is in a few sites that are comparatively larger, sites like Free Republic or Instapundit, or related sites. And so this leads to very different dynamics. For the past several cycles, we've seen, and I would say even up to and including 2010, the internet has been more important and a greater resource for liberals than conservatives. We've started to see some evidence of that gap narrowing, but in terms of raw traffic, we're nowhere close to that.
Professor Hindman, when we talk about the mainstream media,
Yeah.
New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, what's been their success or non-success on the internet?
I think it's important to understand first that most of the news that people actually consume online is still online outposts of traditional media. CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, and even when that isn't true, outlets like Yahoo, which is now, by some measures, the largest news site on the web, or outlets like the Huffington Post, most of what they're doing is aggregating and reposting content that was originally created for print. So Yahoo, for example, reprints an awful lot of wire service news. So in terms of the total number of people who actually visit at least once over the course of a month, the online news category looks pretty healthy. Hundreds of millions of Americans visit online news at least a few times a month. Again, the issue is that the overall traffic is quite small, and we have to be careful about reading too much into the fact that of online news when a lot of the visitors to Yahoo, for example, are looking at that site just a few minutes a month.
The Drudge Report.
So the Drudge Report is an interesting site, partly because it's very important in redistributing traffic. Lots of people go to Drudge, and it redistributes a lot of traffic, particularly to right-leaning websites. So it's partly straight news, but definitely has a bit of an editorial slant as well. Oftentimes, what you see with websites is that there's a period when the niche is more or less fluid. where early sites have a big advantage, and if they start out, if they're relatively big early on, then they tend to stay pretty big.